och välkomna till NODs podcast och Teologer samtalar. Jag heter Maria Ledstam och jag är lärare och forskare i systematisk och praktisk teologi och etik. Idag kommer jag att prata med professor Luke Bretherton som just nu befinner sig i London. Och Dr. Bretherton är Robert E. Cushman Distinguished Professor i moralteologi på Duke University i North Carolina. Han är även gästprofessor på St. Mellitus College i London. Och för bara några veckor tillkännagavs att Luke Bretherton kommer tillträda som professor i moral- och pastoralteologi vid Christ Church på Oxford universitet. Och vid sidan av det akademiska arbetet så har Dr. Bretherton jobbat med flera olika trosbaserade NGOs och kyrkliga organisationer runt om i världen. Och han är engagerad i olika former av gräsrotsdemokrati och community organizing både i USA och Storbritannien. Och han har även en podcast som heter Listen, Organize, Act där han bjuder in olika gäster för att prata om kyrkan och olika former av demokratiska rörelser på gräsrotsnivå. Brethertons senaste bok kom 2023 och heter A Primer in Christian Ethics and the Struggle to Live Well. You can see it there. Och det är denna bok som samtalet primärt kommer att kretsa kring. Andra böcker av Bretherton är bland annat Christ and the Common Life, Resurrecting Democracy, Christianity in Contemporary Politics, och Hospitality and as Holiness. So, Dr. Bretherton, welcome to the NOD podcast, and thank you so much for being with us today.
No, absolute delight and pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
And congratulations on your new position at Oxford University.
Thank you.
that's really good news.
I hope it will be. I hope it will be.
At least you will be closer to Sweden.
That is true. Easier travel
to come and visit. Yeah, we are happy for that. So some of our listeners are very familiar with your work, and I also gave a short introduction in Swedish about your academic background and current positions. But could you please introduce yourself a little bit more for those of our listeners who are not familiar with you?
Yeah, so I'm a Londoner born and bred, and I'm actually sitting in West London, just up from Shepherd's Bush, if people know London, and kind of lived here all my life. But then for the past 12 years, I've been teaching at Duke Divinity School in North Carolina. And then as your introduction just indicated, I'm just in the process of moving back and will be starting at Oxford University at Christ Church College, which is a kind of joint ecclesial and academic post in the new year.
Yeah, and throughout your work, you ask and write about, you ask important questions, and you write about Christianity and politics and how church could get involved in the local community and do politics. And what got you interested in these questions to start with? So how did you get involved in these kind of questions?
No, it's a good question. I think I kind of two very significant formative moments really, I think, shape my work. One is really the home I grew up in. So my parents were they weren't actually converted through Billy Graham. There was a very significant crusade by Billy Graham in the 1950s in England in the kind of post-war, post-Second World War era. And they were of a moment, lots of people got converted. My parents were kind of part of that wave. And so had a strong evangelical faith, and then got involved in the charismatic movement. But they were always very, very concerned with their local community and the kind of state of the common life. And they moved into Notting Hill, which is now a kind of enclave for bankers of various kinds. But back in the day was a very poor area and notorious for being a kind of center of slum landlords and very, very corrupt and quite violent housing practices. And they moved there in 1961. And this was the same moment when the first folk from the Caribbean were coming over to work in kind of public utilities and buses and things like that. And because of racist housing policies, they couldn't really get access to good housing. And so they were very dependent on slum landlords. There's a very notorious slum landlord called Peter Rackman, and he actually has an act of parliament named after him. And he would, along with many others, take their deposit checks. They'd go in the house for a week, and then he'd send round his heavies and kind of throw them out, throw their stuff out the window, and then put in his prostitutes. And this was a whole racket that was going on. And some of these people were in my parents' church, and they were kind of shocked and appalled by how these kind of new neighbors really were being treated. And so we've got to do something about this. So they set up what's called a housing trust or housing society, housing association. These are different terms about which is no. And there wasn't really any government legislation for this. And I think in the Swedish context, it'd be kind of slightly unusual. In the British context, these kind of self-generated civil society solutions to problems are quite a kind of common thing. And they're very much part of that dynamic. And so that they kind of literally went around friends, family, raised money, and their kind of strapline was to provide good quality housing to low-income families. And that very much ran out of our front room. And neither of my parents would, they weren't into liberation theology or social justice concerns. They were quite culturally conservative. But like they had a deep sense that you had to treat neighbors or to see strangers as neighbors, not as either commodities to be exploited or kind of units of social administration, that you had to relate to people. And the work they did, my mother was the housing officer for many, many years, and it was very relationally driven. She died actually earlier this year, but I was reflecting on this at her funeral. And she kind of knew everyone. It was like she turned the city into a village. You'd walk, it would drive me crazy as a kid because you'd go down the market and my mum would have to stop and talk to everyone. And I just wanted to get back to watch TV, and kind of was very frustrating. But I realized, kind of reflecting back, this kind of, it was a form of politics. It was a politics of a kind of common life, but highly relational, wasn't party driven. It was about cultivating a more just and generous shared life wherever you were from, because you were part of the neighborhood, and that was born out of a deep Christian commitments, and same with my father. And so that deeply shaped my sense. And part of that also, as I said, my parents are kind of very culturally conservative. My dad was voted Tory all his life and would, make various comments that would be sound like some right-wing populists today that are all about to be elected across Europe. But actually within that, they had a remarkable capacity to build relationship across deep divisions. And a good example of that was actually my mother, the first school I went to, primary school, which is a Church of England school, got burnt down in the 1980s. And the vicar who was attached to the school, because the school was related to a Church of England church, was someone called Father David Randall. And you couldn't get someone who's more opposite to my parents. David Randall, my parents are very culturally conservative on matters of sexuality and all the rest of it. Father David Randall, this was in the late 1970s, early 80s. He was openly gay, lived with his partner Paul, was a founding figure of Pax Christi, which is the Christian version of the nuclear disarmament program, Christian socialist, was introduced, one a key figure introduced liberation theology, early adopter of liberation theology into the UK. And, my father and David Randall, they never liked each other, but they did a lot of work together. They recognized and respected that even despite their ideological differences, their differences of really fundamental questions of what it meant to be a Christian, they shared a common concern for the area they lived in. And many a Thursday you would find David Randall at our house. They would have dinner, pray together, and then work on whatever project, whether it's rebuilding the school as a better institution or some other local project, youth club or whatever. And so that sense, that just felt kind of normal to me. And I look back on it in our contemporary polarized moment when it seems like to even talk to people who you disagree with, let alone have a very constructive working relationship over many years, is like you're a traitor to your cause. And so I think that capacity to, as a Christian, care for, have concern for constructively and practically, and work with others across deep divides to forge and cultivate a more just and generous common life, profoundly shaped my own orientation, and that this should be part of Christian witness, but often wasn't. And I think the other key moment, when I left university, I had the privilege of working in Central and Eastern Europe. Just after this was in the very early 1990s, after the Berlin Wall came down, and in kind of reconstruction of post-communist society, and seeing there the kind of two extremes, had the privilege of working with extraordinary Christians who'd been involved in the kind of pro-democracy movement, had really suffered been persecuted for their faith under communism, and kind of key in really trying to reconstruct society, a world in which you had turbocharged capitalism, kind of legacy structures of state socialism, every religion piling in under the sun to kind of convert the heathen communist kind of population, the rise of really populist dictator figures, early days of Putin, etc. And then also the kind of rise of ethno-religious nationalism, particularly obviously in the collapse of former Yugoslavia, and the role of the church both as an agent of democracy and of forging a more moral and just life, and as an agent that was leading to the collapse and destruction and eventually violent civil war. And trying to make sense of this, how did the church kind of make sense, kind of operate, and what were the forces which pulled it in one way towards anti-democratic and authoritarian politics, and what were the forces which pulled it, and what the kind of theologies which enabled this constructive move? And really, out of those two experiences, I would say kind of three questions that have shaped my work kind of emerged, which is, if we're going to love our neighbor, we're always at that point going to encounter questions of suffering, injustice, oppression. So how do we respond to that? If we're going to address love of neighbor in that context, we're going to have to deal with questions of power and how it's distributed. And often people don't want to, have a very sentimental view of neighbor love, but you have to address and analyze power. And then lastly, if you're going to love your neighbor, you're inevitably, like my parents, going to be encountering people who are not like you. So the question of who might believe very different things to you. So are you going to respond to them? What does neighbor love look like? How do you retain your Christian commitments or your cherished convictions without killing, coercing, or causing others to flee, but form a common life with them? And those really seem to me the kind of existential questions confronting the church, and really that are shaping the plausibility of the gospel. How do we deal with questions of suffering and justice? Are we attentive to questions, meaningfully and justly attentive to questions of power? And how do we respond to the other, the stranger, the enemy? And these seem to me questions central to the Bible, central to Christian reflection, but often largely absent in kind of the preaching and teaching we see in churches.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful, and I think it also relates to the theme of this issue of NOD, that will ask questions about, is the Swedish society becoming more cold, and are we losing our solidarity or neighbor love, to use the theological language? And I think what you tell us here is very helpful for that. And I really think the story from your childhood, or from bringing up, from your upbringing, where you say, my dad and what was his name?
David Randall.
They never liked each other, but they did a lot of work together. I think that's a very beautiful story. I think
this thing you don't have to be a good neighbor. There's no requirement to like your neighbor.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I think we often get confused by that. I
Yeah.
don't have to have warm feelings towards my neighbor to
Mhm.
love them. And that's central. And we might come on to this, but
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
central question of enemy love and what does that
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah, that's very important. I think we will come back to that. So talking a little bit about your latest book, A Primer in Christian Ethics. What inspired you to write this book? I know you've been teaching ethics for a long time, so.
Yeah, I mean, at a kind of most basic level, I've been teaching 20 plus years, kind of introductions to Christian ethics, in both in the European context and the American context. So the book is really a kind of a drawing together of that experience and trying to kind of synthesize that. But I think in a sense, there's not a need for another introduction, but I did feel we're at a particular moment when the kind of a lot of the existing introductions to ethics have quite a kind of technical feel. But there feels we're in this moment when a lot of Christians are seeking almost life advice as kind of wisdom for living. And there's a lot of people out there offering. Jordan Peterson, if people, your listeners know of his work, but it's kind of huge figure, huge young people, millions listening into his podcasts, and there's various lifestyle gurus and people turning to Stoicism or Buddhism, and I didn't really feel kind of one slightly joking way is it's an alternative to Jordan Peterson. It's a kind of how do we live a good life and what Christian wisdom is there for that, rather than a kind of technical academic introduction. So it is both an academic introduction, but it's also trying to put forward a compelling vision for for kind of a wisdom about life. And this is a long tradition going back to the ancient world, and we can think about Stoicism or Epicureanism or these kind of ancient philosophies as really schools for life. And I think Christianity, and certainly the patristic writers, viewed it in this way and tended to write in this way. But how do we understand kind of really Christian ethics more is about a school for life than a set of quite technical academic moral theories. And it's mostly taught as a collection of moral theories where you have some great ideas at the end of your course and have no idea how to live well.
Exactly.
And so I thought, what would it mean to write a book that actually helped you think about how to live well, being shaped by academic kind of reflection? But that's really the orientation, and particularly for those, and this is all my academic kind of life, I've taught people going into Christian mission and ministry. And so it's a particular orientation to folk who are wanting to be involved in the church, wanting to be involved in kind of mission of the church and various ministries, whether chaplaincy or NGOs or working for a development agency or whatever. How do we take that up? And then the other thing I think that's key that drove me to write the book was, I think so much what passes for Christian ethics today is really a form of ideological checklisting, whether of the left or the right. And people are taking their sense of what it means to live a Christian life from some kind of, ideological menu, which they have to sign up to. And these are largely incoherent, and actually quite anti-Christian in how they orientate you to the world, and then tend to then lead to polarization and this kind of treating everyone who disagrees with you as an enemy. And so that does feel like a particular intense moment we're in across particularly Europe and America, but I think elsewhere in the world as well. And so the book tries to speak to that context. And I think thirdly, I'd say the book is really an attempt to take seriously a lot of the, we might say, wounds of the world. In a sense, a lot of these ideological responses, whether of the left or the right, are responses to real wounds, to real questions, whether it's the kind of disempowerment of ordinary people, which I think is largely driving this populist upsurge, and a lack of a sense of agency, or the kind of wounds around gender and sexuality and kind of mistreatment of kind of minorities. those cries are coming up. How do we abide with them and take them seriously, even as we might disagree with certain ideological constructions? And so you have to hear the wound even as you disagree with the way people come to think about how to address that wound. And so that's part of what I'm trying to do in the book.
Yeah, and relating to that, you have like 3 tasks of Christian ethics that you flesh out, and the first one is describing what's going on, right? And here, listening is as a central aspect of doing that task. So could you tell us a little bit more about that task of Christian ethics?
Yeah. So yeah, the kind of book's divided into 3. There's the first is describing well, the next is acting well, and then last is kind of living well with others. So that first task of describing, there's a great guy, and it's drawn from the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who has this whole thing that you can't act in a world you can't describe or you can't name. And so how do we come to describe the world? How do we come to name what's going on around us? And of course, naming makes all the difference in the world. Like, do I name someone as a refugee or as an illegal migrant? Do I name someone as a citizen or a kind of enemy? So these namings really orientate us to the world. And so listening is often we take our cue for how we name the world from some ideological framework or from some other quite abstract idea. We don't take it from listening to what's going on. And really, I would ask the kind of fundamental question of ethics that it begins with, and this is a very ancient orientation, is asking the question, what's going on? And do I take the time to ask that, or do I jump to the question, what is to be done? And there's I've slightly put this jokingly to my students. It's a terrible academic joke, so forgive me. It's probably very unfunny, but it makes me laugh. So, there's the greatest album, I think, of the 20th century is Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On," and it's the kind of great question. It's a beautiful bit of soul music, but it's a great question to ask. And there's also a very important document produced by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin at the beginning of the Russian Revolution called "What is to be Done." And I always joke, you're on dangerous territory if you ask Lenin's question before you ask Marvin's question. So begin with Marvin's question before we move to Lenin's question. And so thank you, you're laughing, you're humoring me. But yeah, so I think that sense of, if we're going to listen, if we're going to ask what's going on, we have to listen to others. We have to listen to creation. We have to listen to scripture. We have to listen for God. What is God doing? Where is Christ at work? Who is before me? How do I orientate myself and attune myself to God's creation and put people first, rather than have some prior program I worked out rationally in my head and then apply that to the world and think that's more. And I think that very act itself is immoral. It's putting program before people. And we always have to put people before program and attend to their life, their loves, what they cherish, work out where the Spirit is moving, what Christ is doing. And that act itself, the act of listening, is itself an ethical act. It says, you matter. You have a story to tell. You are somebody. You are worth listening to. So it's actually a way of valuing the neighbor. It's listening itself as an act of neighbor love that's very countercultural. Mostly people think they already know what's going on. They just have to get others to agree with them. Or mostly they think, I don't need to listen to you because my ideological analysis, my theory, my pet kind of conspiracy theory, whatever it is, tells me that I'm either going to recruit you or I'm going to kind of diminish your humanity by treating you simply as a kind of placeholder for whatever I think if you're kind of someone who's committed to pro-life politics, and in the American context, want guns and various other things. I, as a good progressive liberal, I've already dismissed you. I've already labeled you, stigmatized you. Don't think I have to listen to you. You're nobody I have to take seriously. And the same in reverse.
Mm-hmm.
And so listening, actually, it's a way of taking seriously the human person, the human face before me.
Mm.
And that itself orientates me rightly. And so there's this crucial question of what's beginning with what's going on. But in that very beginning point is an orientation to hear, and therefore an act of humility, which says, I don't know. You might, even though I radically disagree with you, you might have something to teach me about how to live well.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a profoundly moral, ethical orientation that gets us off on the right foot. And so often in moral political questions, the kind of foot we begin with gets us in the wrong direction. And so listening, I think, gets us in, at least has the hope of orientating us rightly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you even say that listening is a crucial part of becoming a moral and political being.
Yeah.
I think you're drawing on Simone Weil and Bonhoeffer. Yeah. And I think that's very. I really appreciate this part of the book, and I think you write this out very beautifully. And you write about 5 sources that we should listen particular to in this part. And then you already mentioned creation and scripture, but you also include the stranger and those people crying for help, right? So why do you include the stranger and people crying for help in this?
Yeah. So obviously kind of classical sources would be, Christian listening to scripture, in creation, whether it's natural law theory or these kinds of things. We often had a place for listening to creation, the book of nature. And I also include there, I call it listening to ancestors, listening to our traditions of belief and practice, whether that's Lutheranism or Catholicism or whatever. What are kind of the wisdom of our mothers and fathers in the faith. But I also include listening to strangers and listening to those crying out for liberation, because I think, and again, it goes back to those questions I began with about responding to injustice and suffering, questions of power and questions of dealing, responding rightly to the other. The first of that is in terms of the stranger. Responding to the other is and listening to the other, the one who's not like me, the one I find difficult, I would say is crucially, again, one of those kind of basic orientations. We too often reduce ethics to a kind of group think. Ethics is just simply what we and people like me think. Well, that's not moral, that's just convention. And so how do we break out of our group think? And that's one thing listening to the stranger does. It kind of, it demands we actually think otherwise, we think differently, we think outside of our comfort zone, and actually get to challenge, because I might have always thought X, but actually X might just be what people in my culture think. It's not necessarily moral at all. And so how do I discern whether it's actually moral or culturally conventional? The other aspect of that is this question of how do I respond to what I don't understand? There's a lovely line that goes back to Plato and ancient philosophy, and it's there in the Church Fathers. This sense of, and it's there. You get it in something like Aquinas. Faith, kind of theology is faith-seeking understanding. Philosophy and theology begins with trying to understand what is different to me, what I don't understand, what I don't know, what I find strange, and I would add the stranger. To refuse to learn, to refuse to be interested and curious about those I don't know or not like me, is to choose ignorance over wisdom, is to choose foolishness over growing in understanding. And so this is, again, it's one of those fundamental orientations we often miss, but I think it's a fundamental moral orientation and where we are tuned to the reality of our situation rather than simply repeat the kind of nostrums and conventions and of our particular little bubble of the world. And then in terms of related to that and building on that, learning to listen to those crying out for liberation, those who are on the underside of history, who are suffering the wounds of our ways of life, is crucial, because particularly, and I speak as a kind of more middle class, white male, if I just read the world and understand the world and come to my answers about what's going on simply from my experience of it, that's going to be shaped by a particular set of experiences. And often that's going to be shaped by my understanding of how the world works for me. But learning to read the world from the experience of those who suffer because of the way the world is currently organized is actually to really hear what is going on. So, for example, if I want to understand McDonald's as a company, I could talk to the board members and read their accounts and read their management accounts. If I only did that and never talked to the workers and those who worked on the shop floor, I would have a very distorted picture of what's really going on. And it's not to say I don't talk to the managers or don't read the accounts, but actually, if I begin with the experience of those working behind the tills and doing the kind of grunt work, and then move from there, it's going to give me a much better sense of how McDonald's works in reality, rather than the kind of branding exercise that is going to come from the top down. And that's the true for our societies. It's true for kind of how capitalism works, how health systems work, how whatever it is. So if we're going to ask what's going on, who do we turn to get a sense of what's really going on? Do we turn to the people who run the world, or the people who have to live with the decisions and the policy consequences of those people? I think we should start from the bottom up. And I think that's where the Bible starts. That's the story of Exodus. That's where Jesus starts in Luke 4. It's this sense of how do you, again, it's a right orientation to, and that orientation is itself moral. So I think listening to strangers, listening to those crying out for liberation is crucial to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was wondering, like, how do you, in when you meet your students, like, how do you help them to listen to strangers and those crying out for liberation? Because I know in your work you include voices, so when they read your work they can hear voices, but maybe we also need to meet stranger and the people crying out for liberation. Do you send them out and doing field work, or?
Good question. I guess it's part of, I've included, well, so part of it is just getting them to read other kinds of voices in the course, but then also I do other courses, not necessarily, I've done it a little bit, taking people out on field trips. But I teach a course called Listen, Organize, Act. It's actually a podcast as well. But in that I teach practices of listening. And teach practices of both listening to our own bodies, what are our own bodies telling us? So listening to ourselves, listening to our communities, and then listening to our broader context. And that's through things like relational meetings, journaling, all sorts of practices of by which we kind of gather intelligence about the world around us, about our situation in the world, and what's going on. So I teach those kinds of practices, as well as taking people out on kind of field trips, but also getting them, because they'll often be involved in kinds of practices in ministries, whether that's kind of soup kitchens or visiting the elderly, so rather than just simply being an act of service, getting them to intentionally reflect on what they're experiencing, what they're noticing, paying attention. And this is a wonderful point that the philosopher Simone Weil makes. It's another way of talking about listening is how do we pay attention? And that's what Weil called it. And it's not simply kind of going and visiting the elderly person and helping them out, beautiful though that is. It's also treating that as a way of almost kind of gathering intelligence about that person's situations, noticing how their carers are treating them, and noticing what's going on in their house, noticing kind of what else is going on around. Are their family present? Are there, so we can learn a lot more about their situation, talking to them, getting to hear their story, and then actively making some notes on that. So it's not just like in one ear and out the other. We're actually learning and growing in our orientation to the world through those kinds of practices. So it is kind of active reflection.
Thank you. That's very helpful. You've been talking about this a little bit already, but you write that it's important where one starts as a theologian, and you start in the practices. I was having a conversation with a colleague the other day. He was presenting a paper he wanted to write about human encounter with creation,
right?
And he had very he shared like a personal story about an encounter with an animal and so on. And then I asked him, so why don't you start there in that practice when writing about that encounter? But instead you're making this theological framework that you're going to apply to that practice. And his answer was that I've heard before, it's so dangerous for theologians to start in the practices, and with experiences, it can go so wrong.
Right.
So I don't know if you've heard that, but how would you respond to that kind of skepticism or criticism to starting in the practice?
Yeah, so I think what people are reacting against is a sense that if you begin with this term, I don't like the term experience. I think it's a problematic term. But if you begin somehow with experiences, then you're beginning with a very subjective sense of things, and we need to be rigorous and systematic. And I make a distinction in the book and more generally when I teach between what we might call kind of inductive approaches, beginning with the reality that's out there, and deductive approaches where I kind of go, and that's a very ancient, again, Plato, and you begin, there's some ideal form, and I kind of get it through a process of rational deliberation, and I come up with a principle, and then I apply that to reality. And that's what your friend was exactly doing. It's following. It's a very, lots of academic life operates like that. But I think that is a fundamental misorientation, because it begins with an abstraction, and it begins with a process as if kind of we can get to what is moral through a process of kind of rational deliberation, and it inherently orientates you to putting program before people. And I think that's just immoral. I think that's an immoral stance. It immediately gets you off on the wrong foot. So it's not a question of starting with experience. It's a question of starting with reality. Is reality something external to me? And is reality, and this is something, the point Pope Francis is making constantly today, is reality always bigger than my ideas about it? So if I begin with my ideas about reality, well, then I'm not actually understanding what's going on. Whereas if I try to discover what's going on with others, so it's not my subjective experience, it's my orientation and listening to, and that's why I have multiple points of what we listen to: scripture, strangers, ancestors. But I'm beginning with the sense that reality is external to me, and I'm trying to discover how God, and again, this is a very modern idea that comes in with Descartes and others, that somehow value and morals are internal, that I then apply to a value neutral reality. And so there's this shift from a kind of notion of we live in a cosmos to which I can learn, if I pay attention to that cosmos, whether it's the creatures or the seasons or other people and their patterns of life, I can learn better how to live well. And God is always at work through the Spirit in creation. And so I have to discern that and discover that through participating, questioning and answering. But that's, in the modern world, it becomes, no. The world out there is just flat, neutral, material nothingness. and I create value, which I then give to it. It's called the fact-value distinction. There's the factual world out there, and then I subjectively create values. And so immediately, what your friend is struggling with is two versions of an internal thing. Either I'm beginning with my internal subjective states, or I'm beginning with a rational process. I'm like, neither of those are good. That's both rubbish. It's kind of magical thinking. We begin with an external reality, and then the question is, how do we orientate ourselves to that and make theological sense of that through a dialogic participatory process? And so that's where the book is trying to model this much more inductive approach that's rejecting both beginning with experience and beginning with some process of rational deduction.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I think we should continue talking a bit about politics and democracy that I promise we should do. When most of us hear the word politics, we might think about fights between political parties or rage tweets, but you describe it, as you already said, as something else, and you say that politics is forming, norming, and sustaining a common life. So could you just elaborate a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. I mean, because I think it's so, we're just about to have an election tomorrow. Yes, tomorrow. Here we are, tomorrow. Elections across, about to be one in France, obviously one in America as well. So there's a way in which, particularly at this moment, politics is always reduced to kind of party politics and what goes on in the state. And I think that's particularly true in Sweden as well. Politics is all about the state. And I'm really trying to develop a very different kind of account. And in that, and really when you boil it down, we can make it very complicated. When you really boil it down, it goes back to this question I began with about responding to the stranger, the other, how that relates to neighbor love. To be human, we cannot survive, let alone thrive, without others. So humans cannot live alone. We die very quickly. And so we're always dependent on others to have even survive, let alone have a kind of flourishing, live well. But as soon as you try and form a common life with others on which you depend, you're immediately going to encounter people you disagree with, you dislike, you find very difficult, they look strange, you find them threatening, whatever it is. And at that point, you only have one of four options. And again, we can be very complicated about that. I could tell you a whole history of political philosophy, but when you break it down, there's one of four options. You can either kill them, you can either create a system to coerce them, so you can get them to do what you want without having to listen to them. You can make life so difficult that you cause them to flee, there's persecution, so they run away. Or you can do politics. You can form some kind of common life amidst asymmetries of power, differences of agency, and competing visions of the good. There will be fundamental differences about what it means to live well. And you can do that without killing, coercing, or causing to flee. And those really are the only options. And I think Christians should be pretty invested in the fourth option. The tragedy is, throughout the world today, people try and solve problems through killing, coercing, or causing to flee, and Christians are just as bad at that as anyone else. And the history of the church, and often local churches, take something as simple as, should we keep the pews in the sanctuary, or should we get rid of them and bring in guitar-based music? Very contentious issues. There's a vision of a common life. There's asymmetries of power. The minister has more power but perhaps the church warden has more power than the ordinary people. There are different views about what should be done, about how our common life should be structured. And what we see, again, not often today, but obviously in the past, there was a lot of killing in responding to differences of doctrinal view. But still, we do see people being very controlling ministers. There's the kind of story of Mark Driscoll and others, but we all see abusive ministers around the place who create very controlling communities where they don't have to listen to anyone and they're in charge. Or we have schism, we have splits, and Church of England could potentially split over gender and sexuality. So these responses are there. That's politics. or are we going to do some kind of politics? And I think the church and the history of, read Acts, read the formation of the political people of God, all the language in scripture for the church is political. It's all because you can't form the people of God. The people of God itself is a political term without doing some kind of politics. And some way, one way to think about ethics at its most basic is that how do you cultivate a just and generous political life, i.e. a common life, in ways that don't lead to killing, coercing, or causing to flee? And so it sounds very simple, but it's, as we know, very hard to do. But that's really what it is.
Yeah. So thinking about the Swedish context, and as you say, if we are to get involved, we will meet people with different visions of what the good life looks like, and then I think some Christians might have a nostalgic dream of, we want the Christian country back.
Christian nationalism, Christian nation.
Yeah. Or others might think, well, how am I supposed to bring my religion or faith into this pluralistic democratic society? So what kind of advice would you give to people who would like to use their faith and their religion in?
No, that's a wonderful question and hard. And I think that in some ways is the question, because I think we've got these two options at the moment. You have those who, out of a sense that who I think real questions about the nature and pace of change, whether that's cultural change through demographic changes and migration, or change in technology, or what, kind of attitudes to marriage, or whatever it is. And there's a kind of, as you say, a danger of kind of wanting to go back and try and recover the kind of supposedly Christianness of the Christian nation. Whether it was ever like that or not is another question. But that sense of which we've got to reestablish control in order to stabilize life and make it fully Christian. That's one response. And then another response, in equal and opposite direction, is people going, well, I've got to kind of, in response to the need to be tolerant, in response to a kind of humanitarian concern, in response to a need to be nice to people I disagree with, I can't be Christian at all. I can't even mention the Bible. I can't even mention Jesus Christ. I can't even, and so I kind of nervously adopt all sorts of weird languages like human rights, or to kind of mask my Christian concerns, because it's somehow impolite or rude or intolerant to talk Christianly in public. And so this is what we end up with, a kind of diffusion in a kind of false humility, a lack of self-love, if you like, and an overly prideful assertion through a vainglorious, wrong kind of self-love, rather than a proper Christian love of our faith in relation with others. And I think part of our problem here is because of the focus on the state, we tend to read the world from the top down, and our news feeds and our social media are all the time obsessing about national policies. On my framework of, there is statecraft, and statecraft matters and policy matters, but actually that's always embedded within and situated within this politics of a common life, of how do we cultivate a common life that begins locally. And so paying attention to how are we building trust with others. A good example would be North Carolina, where I live. I used to live in a cul-de-sac. The kids, and sometimes my kids are involved, with play out, teenagers play out on the street, and there'd be noisy, and there'd music, and being naughty, and I might be wanting to, I've got a deadline, I've got to finish a book. I've got two choices. I can call the police. We've got a vision of the neighborhood and what it should look like. I want quiet. They want a place to let off steam and be noisy. Do I call the police? I turn to the state to solve this problem, at which point that's going to be terrible for them. That's to invoke really a form of coercion. Or have I got trust with them? Do I have relationship with them? Have I listened to them? And I can go out and say, guys, I know it's bad, but do you mind like keeping it down a bit, turning the music low? and they go, oh man, there's a bit of kind of, banter, as we call in England, but they might not, but they might, take it down. Now that's actually doing politics. We're negotiating a form of shared life without cursing, causing to flee, and negotiating different visions of what the neighborhood should be about. We don't think of that as politics, but it is. It's the same as on a PCC or a church council meeting, and how are we going to resolve this matter? And I think if we read the world from the local and how we're actually living, and then read the national from the local rather than the national to the local, I think it orientates us differently. And crucially at the moment, we're in a world, and this is the problem of polarization, where we don't trust each other, particularly in the States and in Britain. And I don't know about that. I don't know the figures in the Swedish context, but I imagine it's my sense is that it's polarization is at work there as well. And so I think one of the most fundamental acts, and it goes back to what I was saying about listening, is building trust. And that's what the church is very good at, whether it's mothers and toddlers groups or soup kitchen. These are all ways of building trust between people. And again, if we think about politics as the formation and cultivation of a shared form of life, we can see that whether it's democracy or the economy, take the economy, an economy, the banks, when they lose trust, as we saw in 2000, 2008 financial crisis, within a week. So I have arguments with my colleagues at Duke. They're like, oh, they come up with big numbers and economic theories and economic laws. And I said, that's all rubbish. It's all rubbish. Without trust, the banks will collapse in a week, and the whole world economy is on its knees. It seems this crazy, intangible, fragile thing that can only be made through kindness, through faith, through having hope that the person isn't going to kill you if you go and talk to them. These intangible virtues are the basis of this great economy we want to have great numbers about. The same with democracy. You can have all the democratic systems and voting systems and sophisticated policy analysis. But as we saw in America on January the 6th, if people don't trust, then the whole thing collapses very, very, very quickly. And people, when the election comes and they don't trust the results, they take to the hills with their AR-15s or their AK-47s, as we see around the world. And so the cultivation of trust through forms of local life, as my parents did in their neighborhood, that was a trust building measure, creating a housing association, is the fundamental basis of our politics, of our economy. And we get very lost otherwise if we lose sight of that. And I think Christians, to do politics as the cultivation of trust, as a mode of neighboring, is actually of world significance. It doesn't feel like it. It feels just like saying hello to my neighbor. It feels like helping the old lady down the street with her shopping. It feels like running a mother's toddlers group for refugee mums who don't have anywhere to go and are stuck in kind of not very nice social housing. These don't feel like grand world-defining gestures, but when you add them up, we see around the world the lack of them leads to civil war, collapse, horrible, 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 evil results.
Yeah, and relating to this kind of local politics, you've been deeply involved in community organizing in, I think, both UK and the US. And could you just share something from that, like some key lessons
Right.
that you have learned?
Yeah, I think, and that's a great question. I think, so people who don't know, community organizing is a way in which it's a kind of political movement, political coalition, but it's very locally focused, and it brings together churches, mosques, synagogues, residents associations, university departments, schools, all sorts of things, local institutions where people gather, can have football clubs, pubs, this kind of stuff. Join a coalition, and it addresses things as simple as like, we need a street light, and how do we kind of move it, to things like a living wage. I was involved in a campaign to get a policy around debt because of post 2007-8 crisis. A lot of people were suffering under credit card, high interest rates with credit cards, that kind of stuff. So it can be very big issues to very, very local, small issues. But the crucial thing about it is it it really embodies this principle of putting people before program. It's non-partisan politics, which brings together people across an ideological spectrum. You see this particularly in the states. Remarkable work in places like Wisconsin, where like large Trump supporting groups and hyper progressive kind of Black Lives Matter working together to ensure internet access during COVID for all families. Because everyone, that was a common issue. Everyone needed it. Everyone schooling was one online, and not everyone had decent access. So very different kinds of people come together to ensure internet access from kind of local providers and stuff. And so I think this question of, if you begin with people rather than ideology, and you begin with people rather than procedure, I think a lot of progressive people want to think, well, let's come up with the right procedure, and that sorts everything out. And that's part of the appeal of rights. We just have got all the rights sorted. We somehow done politics. You haven't done politics. You're confusing procedure with politics. And likewise, if we just get our ideological straight and everyone can agree with us, we'd have done. And again, that's not doing politics. If you demand that everyone you disagree with leave the room before the politics begins, that's a cult. It's not politics. Politics is always about the pursuit of the common and the commons and the common good in the midst of our differences, in the midst of our disagreements, in the midst of it. And so this prioritization of people and their loves and their actual lives has been a really important lesson I've learned, and a really fundamental orientation. And I think the other kind of key, and how that is a very different to either a kind of ideologically driven politics or a kind of proceduralism replacing politics and a kind of technocratic approach. So yeah, I think the other key lesson I've learned is, and this is a line, Saul Alinsky, who was a kind of key founding figure of community organizing in America and Chicago in the 1930s and 40s, very opposed to kind of fascism, and saw it as a kind of way of renewing democracy from the bottom up. He had a great line. He has his rules for radicals. He has a great line that the price of a constructive critique, the price of a meaningful critique, is a constructive alternative. I think a lot of us, and I'm very prone to this, we have great critiques, and academics, we're brilliant at critiques. We're very critiquey. Everything's about, whether it's kind of feminist analysis or post-colonial analysis or I'm a master of all of those. But we don't have much to say about how you should live. Like, what is a good way of living? What is our constructive alternative? And so you see in community organizing, they won't talk about the poor. They'll talk about a living wage. So it's not about debt. It's about responsible banking. So you always frame that, and I think this relates to profoundly, seeing this and observing this related to a profound theological insight for me that kind of generated out of this, which was, and this comes from Karl Barth, God's first word to a sinful humanity is yes in Jesus Christ. And too often the first word of the church is no, not yes. And our first word should always be yes. And in the light of the yes, then there might be a no. And a great example of this in practice is, I've done some work on the hospice movement and hospice care in response to euthanasia. And Dame Cicely Saunders, remarkable doctor in the kind of 50s, develops the hospice movement and palliative care as a yes. Her first word is, what is good care for the suffering dying, and those who are suffering in their dying? It's hospices and the invention of a whole new form of medicine, palliative care. And in the light of that, which you can touch, see, taste, and smell, it's an incarnational reality, I say no to euthanasia. And whatever you think about that issue, it illustrates the point. Now, we contrast that with the abortion debate, particularly in America and Britain, where the first word was no. There's never really been a yes. And now imagine the difference of politics in America if the first word of the church in both evangelicals and Catholics had been yes to we are so for this that we're for anti and prenatal care. We're going to invest in welfare systems for young mums who find themselves in difficulty. We're going to provide all sorts of excellent first kind of education and provision so they can what the world politics would be different if the church had begun with a yes rather than a no. And inevitably, when you begin with a no, people tend to go kind of get lost. You know, we don't want that. So I think it is this very profound point theologically that if we're to witness to Jesus Christ, who's God's yes to humanity, our first word should be yes. And that takes imagination, creativity, listening, working out what can you do given these contexts, and that's moral political reflection. And so I think that's a very important lesson I've learned from community organizing. What does it mean to begin with a yes? And then whatever I might be opposed to is always in the context of what I'm for, which people can come and touch, see, taste, and smell.
I think that's a very good ending of this wonderful conversation. So how do we start with a yes, and what would that mean? Dr. Bretherton, it's been wonderful talking to you, and you are coming to Sweden.
I am coming soon. Very excited. Very much.
Yeah,
I was just also my wife is half Swedish, so it's
oh really?
It feels like I've always had a strong. We celebrate Swedish Christmas with.
Oh, you
I'm
do?
a big fan of much pickled herring, Swedish meatballs, red cabbage. I'm very excited to come.
Oh wow, yeah, and so Luke Bretherton is coming to Pilgrims Höstmöte, and you will be talking about unloving enemies, and you will also, together with Nicholas Lunaba and Sister Katarina, you will talk about stop mourning and start organize. And yeah, we are really looking forward to having you in Sweden, and I hope that you will have a good summer until then, and thank you so much for today.
Maria, absolute delight to be with you, and thank you so much for the conversation, and very much look forward to seeing you in person.